Welcome to the first section of this 5-part series on what I like to call Transcendence. We're going to get right into it here, but before we do, I want to take this opportunity to explain very clearly the foundation of what you're going to learn as we continue, and what Transcendence is all about. The foundation of Transcendence is that our success in anything we will ever try to accomplish, whether you're trying to get through medical school or become a professional wrestler, is ultimately determined not only by how hard we try, or how much time we invest, but by the clarity of our underlying state of mind. And through achieving a state of mind that makes your thinking and insights more precise, your emotions less volatile, and your actions more efficient, anything is possible. But for anything to be possible, we have to have an idea of what we want to achieve. So let's start by talking about success. The idea of success that we're often sold is usually based on the promise that once you have more money and/or time, you will be happier, live more freely, and all of your problems will magically go away. As a life coach who has worked with many financially successful people, I can tell you that money and even free time just doesn't work that way. True, it gives you the ability to take trips, buy things, and feel like a success because you can seemingly have whatever you want. But what it doesn't do is give you the ability to set aside your worries and self-judgment so you can enjoy those trips. It doesn't teach you how to truly appreciate the things that you can now buy, so you constantly need to buy one more thing in the hopes of staying happy. And it doesn't teach you to be happy with who you are before you achieve your goals, making the path to that success miserable and filled with frustration, doubt, and desperation. That's a pretty shallow idea of success. Just the chance to get another unfulfilling job, build more superficial relationships, and buy another bauble while still suffering through the same self-doubt, anxiety, and insecurity? Is that all you deserve in life? I know it's not. And I know from personal experience and the experience of my clients that no matter who you are or what you're going through, you are capable of so much more than you currently think you are. You can have success, fulfillment, and the state of mind to truly enjoy it. You can live the life you know is possible, and you do know it's possible, otherwise you wouldn't be here looking for the way to find it. Part of the trick is accepting that everything up until now has been preparing you for what's next. True, you've been doing things the hard way, battling uphill through challenges around you while carrying a burden within you that you don't know how to put down. But all that means is that you've gained strength, ability, and a heightened appreciation for just how much transcendence will change your life. Now it's about this point that people will usually ask the question, but what's the catch? Why is this video series free when I make my living by teaching these same principles as a life coach? Because not everyone needs a life coach. Some people just need someone to point them in the right direction. They already have the will, the drive, and the desire for change. They just don't know how to get started down a path that doesn't just go in circles. Everything we're going to discuss in this series revolves around one insight that I was lucky enough to have about 20 years ago. And it's taken most of the time since then to figure out that the easiest way to explain it is this. For most of my life, I believed that happiness was the result of meeting certain standards in our daily lives. I believed that if I had the perfect combination of job, home, identity, and friends, that I could achieve happiness. More importantly, I looked at the world as if everyone thought the same thing, and that comparing my result to theirs would give me a good idea of my value as a person. Let's call this Perception A. After following the path of Perception A to a state of anxiety, depression, loneliness, and spectacularly low self-esteem, I found myself in a state where the promise of Perception A no longer seemed worthwhile or even possible. I gave up, and somewhere in that process of giving up, I had an insight that made everything else clear. The traits that we most want to experience, happiness, intelligence, confidence, creativity, and empathy, have nothing to do with meeting some invisible standard. They're always available to us. We have simply forgotten how to access those experiences because of a few understandable reasons that we will discuss in the next 4 videos. Let me give you a quick example. Our minds associate getting what we want with being happy. Now that's not a bad thing because there's nothing wrong with getting what you want. Traveling the world, owning your own home, or realizing your dream of becoming a professional wrestler. These are all great things and you should strive for them if that's what you want. But there's a common misconception that can turn your drive for personal fulfillment into the cheapened addiction of simply getting what you want. Bigger goals can easily get forgotten in impatience for the quick satisfaction of achieving smaller ones. And you go from a mission to experience something fantastic to simply trying to satisfy a craving. What's the misconception that causes this? That getting what you want makes you happy. When we feel unfulfilled or unhappy, we often assume the reason for that feeling is that we lack something. Money, time, attention, companionship, a new car, a bigger house, it could be anything. The important part is that we often assume the reason for our discomfort is that we lack something. What we lack is irrelevant, lack itself is the problem. And the solution to that problem seems simple. Get what you want, and you no longer lack, and without lack, you will surely be happy and fulfilled. And that's partly true, but there's a price. When happiness and fulfillment are tied to getting what we want, then our want becomes a need. And in being needy, we open ourselves up to other types of discomfort, like impatience, frustration, depression, or obsession. And when we do finally get what we want, we feel an immediate relief because we see ourselves as free of the reason for our unhappiness. But after a while, the discomfort returns, and we find ourselves following the same thought process but directing it towards a new want, in the hopes that satisfying that want will once again provide relief. The discomfort and its temporary relief becomes a repeating cycle, and the only logical strategy becomes wanting more. It's a cycle that doesn't end because we misunderstood the original problem. The original discomfort wasn't the result of lacking. It was the result of unconscious behaviors that we're not generally aware of. We assume that we feel better because we got what we wanted, but in truth, we feel better because we've stopped wanting. We've given ourselves permission to feel complete for a while. We just use getting what we want as an excuse for doing so. This will make more sense to you later, but for now let's just say that the things you do in the world will have greater or lesser success based solely on the state of mind that you do them from. Often we make things more complicated than they need to be simply because we don't see that the strategies we rely on are based on our misunderstandings and will often cause more problems that we just don't see coming. And this is the core of transcendence, the realization of our unconscious behaviors so that we can escape the hidden influence and find solutions with less consequence and greater fulfillment. Practicing transcendence brings about a state of intelligence and creativity through every challenge, of empathy and clarity in every relationship, and a state of focus and adaptability that makes even your biggest dreams possible. It's just below the surface, waiting for you to figure out how to unleash it. And that's why I'm making this series, because I know three important things. I know it's possible, and I know this firsthand. I know it's awesome, also firsthand. And I know you can do it, because if I can do it, anyone can. The only real question is, how badly do you want to experience something new? And don't take this question lightly. Saying you want to change is easy, but the only way to experience something truly new is to be ready to abandon what you already know. Are you ready to give up the world you've become so familiar with so you can discover the life of wealth, fulfillment, happiness, and freedom that you already know is possible? And be honest with yourself, this journey is not for the faint of heart. Commitment is the single biggest factor in how successful you're going to be in both learning and applying Transcendence principles. So if you're ready, let's continue on to section number 2. Congratulations, you've made it to the second section of this series, and by continuing on, made a symbolic commitment to changing your life. Not a commitment to me, but to you. Because the important thing to remember here is that this is your life. If it's not important to you, who should it be important to? And because it is so important, I want to be straight with you from the start and tell you very seriously that this information isn't just about feeling better. It's information that can give you the strength to face any challenge or tragedy and the clarity to surpass every obstacle. This is life-changing stuff to anyone who's ready for it. Now I know I'm making some big claims for a free video series, but I promise that if you stick around until the end, you will see exactly what I mean. Your brain is a tool. It works in a specific way and for a specific purpose, like a chainsaw. But also like a chainsaw, not understanding how it works or how dangerous it can be can lead to unintended consequences, and mastery of it can lead to something beautiful. This video series is going to cover the 3 cognitive behaviors that most limit your life, and by the end, give you tips on how to use those behaviors to your advantage. Let's call them Transcendence hacks. This section is all about habits and how they affect our daily lives. Now don't worry, I'm not going to tell you which habits are good and which habits are bad. I'm simply going to talk about how our ability to create and break habits might be useful on our path to transcendence. It's important to remember that your brain is made to form and break habits based on what you perceive as best for you, and it does so using a mechanism called the habit loop. The habit loop is a neurological loop that governs any habit. It consists of 3 elements: a cue, a routine, and a reward. The more you do something that you feel is beneficial, the more your brain adapts to make that thing easier to do. And when you deliberately stop doing something habitual because you recognize a consequence, the brain once again rewires itself to avoid doing that thing. The brain does this naturally as a way of making itself more efficient. If it helps, think of the brain as a well-designed computer with parts for different functions. It uses the prefrontal cortex for decision-making and the basal ganglia for memories, pattern recognition, and habits. Now, when it can rely solely on the basal ganglia, it does so, and the prefrontal cortex becomes less involved. Now, this is good news and bad news because it means that you can, through will and focus, develop a habit that helps you for years to come. And your brain's tendency to rely on the basal ganglia will maintain the habit and refine it to make it more efficient as you get older. But it also means that you can, through ignorance or confusion, create habits that create unexpected consequences like anxiety, depression, or low self-esteem, and the basal ganglia will once again reinforce those behaviors instead. So how do we know which habits help and which don't? By looking back at the habit loop itself. Each habit starts with some kind of discomfort or cue, and then a strategy or routine is created for dealing with it. Control, judgment, looking for external validation, looking to the future, looking to the past. These are all simple strategies that we use to deal with everyday discomforts, and on the surface they appear to work or offer a reward. Feeling in control will alleviate your anxiety. Judgment of others or validation from others will alleviate self-doubt and loneliness. And focusing on the past or the future will make the present less overwhelming. This is all true. But outside of that initial benefit and the short-term release of discomfort, these strategies go on to create other consequences that we often overlook simply because the discomfort they cause seems unrelated. As I mentioned in the first section, our belief in wanting as a strategy for relieving discomfort creates a habit that makes wanting more and more important, while simultaneously making the achievement of those wants less and less rewarding. A loop is created where the strategy actually helps reinforce the problem that it was originally meant to solve. Belief in looking to the future as a means of motivation leads to impatience, disappointment, frustration, and depression. Belief in the past as a measure of what's possible leads to feelings of limitation, envy, and blame. Belief in control as a path to optimal satisfaction leads to anxiety over the loss of that control. And belief that value comes from how much you accomplish leads to restlessness, agitation, stress, and a growing inability to relax. But because we see that the action has or promises an immediate solution to what we perceive as our primary fear, we tend to ignore the long-term consequences as unrelated. The more we believe in the payoff, the more likely we are to determine that that action is appropriate for whatever new uncertainty we find ourselves facing. It becomes easier to rely on and becomes a habit or a reaction. And after a while, the habit itself offers the comfort of familiarity, and an addiction is born. An excellent example of this is a simple mistake that often results in toxic relationships and marriages. The common belief that happiness can only be found through a romantic relationship or marriage offers the hope that the discomfort of being alone will disappear once you have a partner to support you. This very subtle thought can create a habit of codependence, where one party grows dependent on the other for validation and becomes increasingly dissatisfied with whatever attention they are given. A toxic loop is formed, wherein one party has unreasonable expectations and the other party becomes resentful. Now, because the relationship is seen as the sole solution to the discomfort of being alone, both parties continue the loop of expectation, validation, and dissatisfaction, regardless of the obvious fact that the relationship itself is far more uncomfortable than being alone ever was. According to the Arizona Council of Compulsive Gambling, this behavior is identified as the second stage of compulsive gambling, where the addict will increasingly rely on previous strategies and ignore larger consequences in the hope of a big payoff at the end. It's described as a self-delusional state and results in the addict losing much more often than he wins, and consequently betting even more money in the frantic race to win it all back, a practice known as chasing his losses. The ACCG goes on to warn that it's at this point that other types of deceptive and negative behavior occur. Without being aware of our brain's tendency to create and rely on habits in this way, it becomes very easy to simply fall into a routine of comfortable reactions and familiar perceptions. Without awareness of habit as a mechanism, it becomes easy to confuse our mechanistic reactions for our personality, rather than just the result of our brain trying to be comfortable and efficient. But what happens when we are aware that our brain is creating habits? Our habits change. If I can simply realize why I need to feel more valuable, more in control, or more accepted, if I can let go of my attachments to the end result that seems so important, then I can retain my ability to see and avoid the consequences that are coming. Now I've created a pattern of self-awareness that creates an entirely new experience in every facet of my life. And the best part? The more I do it, the easier it gets. And that leads us to Transcendence hack number 1. Mastering habits requires you to be aware that they are always forming, breaking down, or being reinforced because they appear beneficial and the brain is trying to reduce discomfort and uncertainty. It's not a bad thing unless you forget that it's happening and the consequences turn you into someone that you normally wouldn't be. Breathe before you act. Before you react to something, ask yourself how many times you've relied on that reaction before. What were you trying to accomplish? And in that split second that you don't react because you've questioned the reaction itself, a new choice is available. Doing this will build a constant state of awareness that takes practice at first but will eventually become second nature. The only thing it requires is time and attention. How much time and attention depends upon mastering another behavior which I will discuss with you in the next section. So by now you've started looking for habits in your own behavior, and most likely you've started noticing them in others as well. What's important to remember is that we actually have interwoven layers of habit affecting one another all the time. Our habits of control affect our habits of need, which in turn affect our habits of competition, which can then, if things don't go as we want for a long period of time, create or reinforce habits of depression and self-judgment. It can all seem very confusing unless you can identify a common root, and that's where Transcendence hack number 2 comes in. In the last video, I asked you to not only watch for your habitual reactions, but to also, if possible, ask why they were there to begin with. What is the benefit that makes each habit or reaction so tempting? What could possibly lure us into the same trap over and over again and make us willing to completely overlook any potential consequence? The answer is more simple than you might think. Our deepest sense of uncertainty doesn't come from fear of the future or fear of the unknown. It comes from the fear of not knowing who we are. And to answer that question, we use a very simple mechanism: identification. The mechanism of identification is the reason we form our most destructive habits. To put it simply, it's our ability to take a simple mistake, frustration, or an unfortunate event, and turn that into a believable reflection of our own value. It's the behavior that can turn almost anything into a self-defining concept and turn the smallest issues into the biggest problems. Low self-esteem is a perfect example. People who suffer from low self-esteem or low self-worth feel that their perception of themselves is absolute truth. It's not that they feel like they're worthless. They think they feel that way because it's the truth, and often their actions justify their beliefs as a result. Even if that low self-esteem came from childhood abuse or a situation that was completely beyond their control at the time, they still think it's the truth simply because their self-concept makes it impossible for them to see and take advantage of opportunities that would otherwise be obvious to them. Just like with the mechanism of forming habits, understanding the mechanism of identification is the way to transcending it. And understanding it means discussing why the brain developed it to begin with. We know the brain develops habits for the very simple convenience of not having to completely reanalyze every experience anew. By working with habits, the brain is able to reuse old information to make similar tasks easier and ideally free up attention and energy for new insights and observations. So to be clear, the brain's behavior of forming habits is not a bad thing. It's a really cool tool and the reason that you can parallel park while having a conversation. But, like the chainsaw we mentioned earlier, not understanding that tool and using it carelessly can lead to serious problems. And the mechanism of identification is very similar. It forms the most basic level of certainty, and it provides us with a way to feel less confusion about the world and our role within it. A simple exercise here is standing in front of a mirror and writing down a list of 10 or 20 things that you think someone you had just met might notice or say about you. When you're done, go through the list and write a plus or a minus sign beside each point to indicate whether you see that point as a positive one or a negative one. Go ahead and pause the video and give it a try. You see that list of observations and the positive and negative perceptions you have of each one? What you've just identified is a small part of the pattern that defines you. It's your reference for what you feel are your strengths, your weaknesses, your preferences, and your personality. Now, this self-image or self-concept is commonly referred to as the ego, and it's made up of variations of negative and positive perceptions according to how you assume it would compare to someone else who is most likely fictitious. This habitual identity is the lens with which you create and maintain all of your other habits. It's the reason that you judge yourself or fear judgment from others. It's the reason you fear being alone or unloved. It's the reason that you're here watching this video. Your identity is actually a habit that can never be satisfied because it exists as a solution to a problem which is absolutely unsolvable: uncertainty. Identification creates a point of origin. It answers the question, who am I in all of this? Unfortunately, it does so by using the very simple and crudely inefficient mechanism of comparison. As we grow up and experience new things and meet new people, we are able to make more comparisons, and over time we develop a very well-formed and efficient habit of seeing ourselves a certain way in relation to how we perceive everyone else. Unfortunately, because it is in relation to everyone else, there is the danger of having those perceptions influenced by need or fear. Developmental psychologist Jane Loevinger theorized that our sense of identity, or our ego, should go through numerous stages in its development. Stage 1 is pre-social and involves establishing the understanding that we are separate from everything and everyone around us. With that separation comes fear, so stage 2 is impulsive or selfish because we judge everything according to whether or not our wants and our needs are being satisfied. By stage 3, our ego is self-protective and attempts to establish a basic sense of certainty through comparison to others and reliance on a morally prescribed, rigidly enforced, unchanging order as the basis for its judgment. If maintained for too long, an older child or adult who remains in this stage may become opportunistic, deceptive, or preoccupied with control. At this stage, morality is essentially a matter of anticipating rewards and punishments, with the motto, "Don't get caught." And finally, stage 4 is conformity. This is where we attempt to further establish certainty by investing time and energy into obtaining approval from peers that we feel share our moral code, and judging those that don't as inferior. Loevinger described this stage as having the greatest cognitive simplicity. There is a right way and a wrong way, and it's the same for everyone or broad classes of people. This stage is dependent on division and comparison, so empathy and understanding are very difficult. How can you relate to others when your focus is on building, maintaining, and defending your own sense of self? Now think for a moment about your own self-perceptions, and ask yourself if any of them stem from a need to protect yourself from judgment or to gain approval from others. Most likely they do. It's actually very common. Now this next part is really going to blow your mind. There are 6 more stages. We've barely scratched the surface of our development, and with the knowledge that an undeveloped ego is the root of our most destructive habits, that is an exciting revelation. At stage 5, the ego undergoes a radical transformation by becoming self-aware without need or protection as its primary motivators. Loevinger considered this self-aware transitional stage to be the model for adults in our society, and thought that few pass the stage before at least the age of 25. With less fear and need, the ego becomes a tool rather than a master. An individual at stage 5 has an increase in self-awareness and the capacity to imagine multiple possibilities and situations, as well as a deepened interest in interpersonal relations. And of course, stages 6 through 10 describe an even greater sense of freedom, strength, and ability, where the ego is increasingly used as a tool for insight and not perceived as a measure of our actual value or worth. And that switch from establishing a sense of certainty through comparison to a state where our mindset is based on self-reflection is the foundation of Transcendence hack number 2. Always keep in mind that your identity is false as long as it is in comparison to your assumptions of others, and that any attachment you might have to that identity is largely based on the comfort it provides as a habit. Remember that a habit only continues unquestioned until it's noticed as a consequence. Your recognition that your ego is the source of your worst habits and is only a habit in itself is the key to transcending it. Ask yourself this: if your identity is the story you tell yourself, what happens when you stop telling that story? You unlock your potential. You free up huge amounts of energy and attention for new insights, strategies, and actions that will make the difference between success and failure. Athletes often refer to this as the zone, and we've all experienced it at some time or another. It's that state of mind where you seem to be in perfect sync with the requirements of the task before you. Each decision, each movement, and each insight is spot on, and for a time it feels like life itself is effortless. This is what it's like to live without self-doubt, limitation, or fear, and that state is what makes wealth, abundance, and purpose so achievable. Each habit or pattern within us creates a layer of confusion between ourselves and transcendence, and each habit that we discard makes room for more of our brilliance to shine through. But remember not to judge yourself when you see the ego that you've created. That's just adding another layer to it. Remember that our ego is a tool that we have used to ease our fear and confusion as we grew up in a world that we didn't understand. We didn't do anything wrong, but now we found some new information, and the habits that we formed can be let go of so something else can take their place. Your potential comes from removing the prison walls. Don't believe the story you tell yourself. It's based on assumptions and will only continue to lead you down the path that you're already on. Admit that you don't know, and in the next section we'll talk about how to make that easier to accept. Up until this point, we've been talking about the brain as a mechanism for survival, and discussing how understanding the brain's behaviors can give us greater freedom from any of the influences these behaviors have on our happiness, our potential, our goals, and our lives as a whole. In short, we've been looking at the brain as a machine, and as with a chainsaw, we're decreasing the danger and damage it can cause by learning how to use it properly. What you're going to notice as you learn, practice, and adopt the first two Transcendence hacks is that your old mentality won't simply disappear because you want it to. Your old reactions and perceptions will pop up, and you will once again be tempted by the false security and comfort that they offer. This is completely normal. Transcendence hack number 3 requires us to go a step further and to understand that our brain has another behavior that makes our ego and our habits almost appear to have a life of their own because of their resistance to being changed. For example, someone who has recently quit smoking because they recognize that it's unhealthy will still feel the same temptation to smoke when they're exposed to one of their old triggers like stress, drinking, or socializing. Someone who suffers from compulsive eating will still feel the temptation to reach for a snack when they're exposed to their old triggers like feeling bored, lonely, or defeated. Even seeing an old friend will often bring about old behaviors and reactions. And it can seem like our old habits are fighting back, but in truth our brain is once again just trying to be helpful. In the early 1600s, Galileo was threatened with imprisonment and eventually sentenced to house arrest for life by the Catholic Church for his support of the idea that the Earth rotated around the Sun. Why would that threaten the Church? Because in several parts of the Bible it implies that the Earth is fixed and immovable in space. So to the Catholic Church, Galileo was not only saying that the common perception of our solar system was incorrect, he was also implying that the Bible itself was wrong. Now you might think that the Church's reaction was a bit extreme, but the world was a very different place at the time. Life was much more uncertain for people. At this point in history, the people of Western Europe had to live under the constant fear of sin and the possibility of death, in a world that was largely lawless, full of corrupt monarchs, and difficult in the extreme. And because of that, many relied on the Church to ease their fears of the world around them, and to provide some sense of certainty and purpose in their lives. The Church, fearing how people would respond to doubt, forced Galileo to renounce his heliocentric beliefs or be imprisoned. Now take a moment to think about that. One simple contradiction was able to threaten an entire empire because it cast doubt on the entire structure of its identity and the comfort of its habitual beliefs. When we hold on to something as our protection from fear, uncertainty, and responsibility, it becomes very difficult to question the validity of what we're holding on to. This difficulty or discomfort is known as cognitive dissonance. In 1957, Leon Festinger introduced the theory of cognitive dissonance, saying, "Cognitive dissonance can be seen as an antecedent condition which leads to activity oriented towards dissonance reduction, just as hunger leads towards activity oriented towards hunger reduction. Essentially, if something makes you uncomfortable, your brain will do what it can to relieve that discomfort through various defensive mechanisms. The greater the discomfort, the greater the defensive reaction. And as we discussed in the previous section, the greatest dissonance or discomfort is caused by thoughts that directly impact our sense of identity, because those thoughts and perceptions give us our sense of value, worth, and certainty. So without understanding hack number 2, our belief in the ego as a reflection of our true value creates a parallel need to protect it because our sense of security and comfort depends on it. Because we see the ego as necessary for our survival, our brain continues protecting, maintaining, and restoring it. Adolf Hitler knew this mechanism very well and relied upon it as a means of changing public opinion. He took advantage of the Great Depression and exaggerated the fears of his listeners, only to then reassure them that he alone could restore their dignity and happiness. He kept it simple, and he knew that the brain's mechanism of trying to reduce cognitive dissonance would do the rest. The behavior of reducing cognitive dissonance is not in itself a bad thing. It's our brain's way of trying to maintain a manageable level of stress in situations that may otherwise feel overwhelming. But when our discomfort comes from a false threat to our false identity, and we take that seriously, we risk making that reaction a habit. And as a habit, defending the ego creates a downward spiral. And that brings us to Transcendence hack number 3. As with habits and identification, being aware of the behavior as it happens is the key to transcending cognitive dissonance reduction. There are typically 4 ways that we try to deal with the discomfort of having our identity threatened: denial, avoidance, vilification, and justification. Until our ego is developed enough to question itself consistently, the mechanisms that we use to deal with cognitive dissonance will be reflective of our need to self-validate. For example, someone who uses control as a strategy for dealing with anxiety might, upon being called a control freak by a coworker, go through thoughts like this: "I'm not controlling, that person is just lazy. I'm allowed to be controlling once in a while if it means getting the job done. That person doesn't know anything because they have some trait that I cannot relate to and therefore have assumptions about that reinforce my identity." None of these strategies do anything to help develop the ego in a healthy way or to disrupt the habit of identification as a whole. They are completely focused on making that person feel right, justified, and valuable through continuing to defend, reinforce, and maintain a state of mind that is in itself still threatened, judgmental, and isolated. And if repeated, these thoughts can become a habit, and the time between feeling better and feeling threatened becomes shorter and shorter. This downward spiral creates an ever-increasing amount of stress, and therefore makes it even more difficult to find the clarity to transcend it. It is incredibly important to remember that your most destructive habits stem from your identity, and that your brain will fight to maintain them so long as you view your identity as the source of your value. The brain is not doing this because your identity reflects the truth. It's doing it because you continue to view it as such. We have spent a lifetime developing our identity and the habits that protect it, so it's going to be tempting to rely on those habits as you apply and practice Transcendence hacks number 1 and 2. You are going to be challenging, reevaluating, and changing each habit as you become aware of them in your day-to-day lives, so your ego will be under the constant threat of uncertainty. And as you deprogram your old habits, it will cause some discomfort, which will trigger the brain's urge to relieve that discomfort through comparison, justification, or judgment. Always keep in mind that your strength and potential is found in discomfort and uncertainty. The more willing you are to question your habits, the easier they are to break. The ego offers the promise of false security and control, but it cannot get rid of its own fragile nature, and it's much easier to defeat it than it seems. In fact, the safety net that you have created in your mind won't take nearly as long to unravel as it did to build. Be patient and practice. Change is happening. And remember, no matter how much the church might have wished for it, Galileo being in prison did not stop the Earth from traveling around the sun. Fun fact, Galileo was eventually pardoned by the Pope, Pope John Paul II, in 1992, 350 years after he died. It's the thought that counts, though. Where Transcendence hacks number 1 and 2 provide awareness of how we're being pushed and pulled, it's hack number 3 that truly sets us free. The basis of this hack is courage, and your decision to stop being afraid of your own potential. By surrendering the false safety of your ego and habitual thoughts, you are opening your eyes to the world as it really is. With less energy wasted on defending yourself from false threats and chasing false promises, you will have the energy, clarity, insight, and enthusiasm that you need to create the life that you deserve. As practice, between now and the final section of this series, I want you to think about the story you've told yourself so far. Who you are, what you're capable of, what you want, and so on. How much of it is true, and how much of it is just familiar, habitual, or based solely on comparison? What makes you the most uncomfortable to question? Use the comment section below to discuss your insights. And remember to pat yourself on the back from time to time. It takes courage to move forward into the unknown, to leave behind life as you know it to discover what's possible. This is the mentality of our greatest adventurers, inventors, philosophers, scientists, and spiritual teachers. The state of mind that doesn't simply wish for comfort and certainty, but lives for the discovery of whatever lies beyond what we already know. Congratulations on making it to the last section of this series. When we started this series, we talked about the very real possibility that there is a state of mind available to us at all times that enables us to perform, feel, and experience life at our very best. Developmental psychologist John H. Flavel described it as metacognition, a state of higher level cognition wherein the subject is aware of their own awareness, or able to think about the behavior of their thinking, in order to develop strategies for improved learning, performance, and cognitive regulation. Although not transcendence in itself, developing metacognition through practicing the hacks we've discussed in this series will allow you to see and stop the habits that are trying to protect your false sense of identity and therefore wasting energy before they get out of hand. Being able to see the habit in action changes how you respond and creates a different outcome. Failures become successes, habits become lessons, and obstacles become opportunities for growth. For example, rather than dealing with fear of judgment through control or vilification, Transcendence hack number 2 reminds us that our view of others is dependent on our view of ourselves. We know that identification twists our perception to suit its needs and alleviate discomfort. So any judgment is based on assumption and need. It is not based on truth and should not be feared. This is true for your assumptions of others and their assumptions of you. Whether you're being judgmental or experiencing judgment from someone else, the solution is the same. Try to show compassion and patience. The stronger the judgment, the greater the need for its security. If it's your need, noticing it is the first step to removing it. None of this will happen overnight. It's going to take practice and time for metacognition to become second nature. And until that point, your very best strategy for success is keeping to the 3 simple hacks that we've discussed so far. Every time you interrupt a self-defining thought pattern or notice a habit, you free up energy for insight, intelligence, creativity, and success. I didn't want to say it at the beginning of this video series because it would have sounded unbelievable, but I would like to take the opportunity now to guarantee that if you practice the insights in this video series with enthusiasm and good intention, your life will change. Even if nothing else changed about your life, the idea of living with less stress, doubt, and worry should be enough to make these insights worthy of your attention. The fact that your improved state of mind will create improvements in your career, your relationships, and your general level of happiness is just an awesome perk. But remember that none of the hacks that we've discussed up until this point will help without your commitment to transcendence itself. Without a constant commitment to realizing a state of mind that is free of any influence or compulsion, a state of total authenticity and potential, the insights we've discussed will become lost and unimportant. And if life had an ultimate purpose, it would be the realization of that state. Throughout history, people just like you and I have had moments of insight where they noticed the behaviors we've discussed in this series. These insights inspired change in how those people perceived the world and acted within it. And because of the profound nature of their individual transformation, the world changed along with them. You've seen quotes by some of these people throughout this series, and it wouldn't take much to find more. These insights bring out the best in us, and they're universally available to everyone. So this begs the question, why are these insights so common, and yet rarely recognized for their importance in our daily lives? Why do we continue to create unnecessary conflict and division in ourselves and in the world around us? From what I can tell, it's because the next stage of our development is always beyond our ability to imagine until insight or consequence makes it relevant. Just as an individual can become blinded to new possibilities by habits and identity, so too can our species as a whole. Often our greatest insights go through the stages of ridicule and opposition before they're even considered as acceptable. For example, Socrates once said that the only true wisdom is knowing that you know nothing, and he was put on trial as a disturber of the peace and ultimately executed for it. Why? Because the collective mentality at the time was unable to hear what he was saying without feeling threatened and invalidated above all else, which was exactly his point. Your mind is a vast network of thoughts, beliefs, and perceptions that influence one another in a constant dance that both creates new useful ideas and jettisons irrelevant ones according to your underlying identity. It isn't much of a stretch to realize that the world is, in fact, a much larger network wherein people do the exact same thing and call the result society. Over time, our species has climbed the stages of ego development together, and as we've grown to transcend our divisive commitment to identity, we have abandoned old practices that were responsible for much of the conflict in our history. There's still more to do, but there's no denying that we have made progress. Slavery was abolished because the recognition that all people are equal spread within our collective consciousness. That change didn't happen overnight. It started with a small group of people who had an insight that made it impossible for them to condone, tolerate, or support the concept of racial or cultural superiority, and in their conviction they caused a ripple that would one day make slavery look barbaric, where it was once considered common. That insight spread from person to person like a self-evident wildfire, and even in a time without electronic communication or flight, eventually changed enough minds to create a tipping point where society itself had to change accordingly. It started with a few insightful individuals who found another way to think and had the courage to act. Our culture today is on the verge of another tipping point where we recognize as a whole that our glorification of identity and our justification of the habits we form as a result are the cause of our biggest problems, both individual and collective. Low self-esteem, social anxiety, self-doubt, relationship troubles, loneliness, guilt, regret, overwhelming thoughts, lack of motivation, spiritual confusion, bullying, discrimination, corruption, and war. Just like slavery, these consequences can be transcended through a state of mind where insight and growth are the primary objective, and it starts with individuals who desire change more than the security of identity and habit. The United States was born from that state of mind. The founding fathers of the United States didn't believe in democracy, they believed in liberty. They recognized that it's a free state of mind that makes a new world possible, and that unless we maintain that state of individual freedom, we will be destined to remain stuck in a perpetual state of conflict, egotism, comparison, and competition, where the only real purpose is momentary satisfaction between consequences. The insights we've discussed in this series are obvious when you think about it, and they always have been. We know it feels better when we're not drowning in our own thoughts and concerns. We know we make better decisions with a clear mind. And we know that life is more fulfilling when we feel free to make our own choices with that clear mind. All we've discussed in this series are a few of our innate behaviors that have been telling us what to do for our entire lives simply because we weren't paying attention to them. By practicing the hacks in this series, you will develop the ability to see those behaviors clearly, avoid their consequences entirely, and see new options that you didn't even know were there. But by all means, don't take my word for it. Commit to practicing the hacks we've discussed in this series for just 1 month, and you will begin to realize it for yourself. As I said earlier, it takes some practice at first, but within a few weeks of honest commitment, you will notice subtle changes that have reduced your overall stress, increased your overall happiness, and made your dreams feel possible. But keep in mind that as you practice and begin to notice these changes in yourself, you are going to want to share your insights with others. I understand that completely. It's why I became a life coach. But depending on your circle of friends, you may notice that these ideas are not always well received, and occasionally they are misunderstood entirely. That's normal. Committing to transcendence contradicts our society's primary motivators, and can sometimes be viewed as a threat to those who have not yet recognized that the threat that they feel is the result of how they think and not the result of what you're trying to tell them. As often as you meet someone who shares your interest and enthusiasm for individual change, you will meet someone who finds that conversation uncomfortable because their own sense of certainty is threatened by it. The more uncomfortable they are, the more likely they are to respond in anger, denial, or avoidance. Don't let it discourage you. The dialogue around subjects like medical marijuana, LGBTQ rights, and equality has been evolving specifically because our collective belief in identity and control is starting to change and evolve as well. Change is happening. Be patient while the world catches up with it. Now, the reason I'm telling you all of this is because the last two key aspects to mastering transcendence are commitment and exposure. Commitment comes from experiencing small moments of transcendence firsthand, seeing the benefits for yourself, and recognizing that state as a door to your own unlocked potential. But if your life is particularly stressful, or your social circle is particularly resistant to these insights, then exposure to discussions that revolve around metacognition will help you avoid falling back into old habits and perceptions. They're also a lot of fun. As I said before, the beginning is always the hardest because you're developing a new skill. Make that transition easier for yourself by doing any or all of the following. Journal your inner dialogue and question the validity, usefulness, and origin of each thought. Changing your habitual thoughts and perceptions gets easier with practice. Start a hobby by yourself or join a group that focuses on practicing presence, silence, or non-thought. Common practices like yoga, meditation, or tai chi are ideal, but many activities can be used for the same purposes with the right frame of mind. Have conversations with people of opposing views and take careful note of your own defensive or offensive responses. These are the tools that your mind has become accustomed to using to defend its identity. Read or study the works of those who have traveled this path before us, not as teachers or authorities, but as fellow human beings who have tried to share insights that you might be able to build upon or learn from in your own journey. Even Buddha said, "Place no head above your own." And connect with others online who share your interest in transcendence by commenting below and connecting through social media. This really is just the tip of the iceberg. The hacks we've covered in this series will act as a compass so you don't get lost again, but adapting them to your particular circumstance or challenge will be up to you. There's just not enough time in one video series to cover everything, but I will be releasing more free videos on how you can practice transcendence in relationships, parenting, business, education, spirituality, and so on. Visit me on Patreon to support my next series, or follow me on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter to get updates on my next release. Most importantly, remember that even without my help or any of the tools that I've provided on this website, the most important factor in all of this is that you recognize that you can do it. You can experience a life of wealth, happiness, and abundance. You can leave behind your current limitations and achieve something that you don't yet fully understand, but many others have tried to share. It is possible. You just need to decide that leaving the security of perception A is the only way to experience something more. After all, what does all of this boil down to? Don't get caught up in assumptions. Don't take yourself too seriously. Don't get too comfortable. And show yourself some compassion. You've done the best you could with what you've understood to this point. Keep it simple and you'll have less to weigh you down. From there, you will have the energy, attention, and creativity that you need to manifest the life of health, wealth, and fulfillment that you deserve.